We'll name the entitled neighbor Karen, her spoilt son Brad, and the former owner of our house Joe. Joe doesn't really matter in this narrative, but he does help to create the scene. To start this story, some background is in order. It spans almost 15 years, hence, until I say otherwise, presume there is a notable time gap between incidents. Karen owned a lot of land next to a well-known leisure lake before we moved in. Since her road was the major access point to several prime lakeside homes and resorts, it wasn't right on the lake, but close enough that it contributed some value. Karen, being somewhat well off, chose to divide her property in 4 halves when her kids came of age. Considering the rest of the family, she handed one to her daughter, shockingly, turned out to be a decent person. Another piece went to Brad, her reckless, partying son. On their holdings, Karen even built homes specifically for both children based on their tastes. Not having her own residence, the 4th half turned into the location of a little convenience store. Remember this. It will come up later. Karen turned over the deeds to her children for their individual properties, maybe to avoid conflicts down the road. I can't fully understand why. While Karen's daughter enjoyed a quiet, decent life, Brad was the terror of the neighborhood. You could probably see where this was headed. Party Central was where his mansion was. You name it. Loud music, inebriated teens, late-night anarchy. You know Brad hosted it. The cops were contacted so frequently that they almost had a permanent post close by. To exacerbate things, Karen paid for all his utilities, water, power, trash. The only name Brad has on file, the property tax. And also, guess what? Karen either missed it or thought Brad had it under control. He neglected it too. The spoiler is, he did not. Soon after the cops dragged him off, his house went under auction. By then, the place was wrecked. Flooring that needed to be totally replaced, holes in the walls, and a large void in the living room floor that directly led into the basement. Enter Joe. Joe wasn't your usual property flipper. It was so awful the bank judged it unworkable, meaning only cash purchasers could afford it. Retired hobbyist, he enjoyed fixing rundown houses for entertainment. He would renovate, buy cheap at auction, and sell to profit somewhat. The property looked ideal when we first saw it on a real estate website. Decent size, excellent area, near a lake where we loved boating and fishing. Although the price was not stated, we decided to investigate driving by Joe working on the house and stop to talk. A pleasant man, he clarified he was getting it ready for sale. Though it was just half finished, we made a casual offer, and he turned us down. Already receiving several offers, he wanted to complete the improvements first. Right enough. Not expecting much, we left our number in case he changed his mind. Surprisingly, less than 2 weeks later, Joe called again. He had to leave the state to take care of his sick sister. If we could acquire financing fast, he was ready to sell the house to us at a fair price. He lacked the time or energy to finish it. The conundrum is Joe, the stand-up person he was, assisted as much as he could. The house was not up to code, and the bank would only sanction the loan if we brought it up within 2 weeks. He projected the time, work, and expenses, and led us through the repairs required to satisfy codes. We obtained a loan double what he requested, and used the additional money for repairs. Even after meeting code, there was a lot to do, replacing subfloors, rewiring, repairing walls, and pulling off deteriorating wallpaper attached directly to drywall. Thanks to some helpful friends, we finished out the task in record time. But after months of labor and sweat, we were ready to enter what we assumed would be our permanent residence. Karen introduced herself that day. Although Joe had cautioned us about her entitled attitude, initially she looked friendly enough. That didn't last. Karen dropped a surprise as we were finishing out the chat. She said we had 30 days to leave and the house belonged to her. Her claim was that Joe had no right to sell it to us. Hence, we had been duped, and panic started. We had invested all of our money and time into this house, only to find it was not ours. We agreed to straighten things out with Joe and the bank after appreciatively thanking Karen for her kindness. Both verified that Joe sold the deed in his name, and that it was legal. The courthouse confirmed it as well. When Karen came back to find out when we would be leaving, We informed her unequivocally we legally owned the house. We sympathized but kept our ground as she then began a sob tale about the property being in her family for generations and how Joe had stolen it amid the turmoil of Brad's detention. We even promised to sell her the house for $100,000, somewhat more than half its market worth. Given we paid $50,000 and added another $30,000 for supplies, not including labor, it was more than reasonable. Karen responded with $40,000, then boosted it to $50,000 because she felt bad for us. When we objected, she shouted insults, called us liars and thieves, and bolted. Karen's shenanigans didn't stop there. Whispers of us stealing the house went like wildfire. While most neighbors turned away from them, one day a self-described neighborhood peacekeeper arrived up carrying a gun, and that we left. Okay, so where did we stop? Yes, the day Karen's rumors turned into something quite threatening. Imagine this. Still somewhat raw from Karen's tantrums and the neighborhood rumors she generated, we are settling into our new house. Suddenly, meanwhile, a truck pulls into our driveway. Now, this was not any ordinary man. He jumps out clearly disturbed and carrying a gun. This was him, the older, tough friend who claims to be the unofficial block sheriff. You know the type. Let's name him Mitch. Most people in our fairly rural area loved Mitch as he had a reputation for settling problems and maintaining peace. But for each other? Saying we were startled would be an understatement. Mitch was simply the man standing in our yard, gun in hand, insisting we get the hell out. Mitch only had the gun in his holster. He was not waving it about or anything. Still, it's disturbing to have a stranger arrive armed and ready to negotiate. We didn't want to let things get out of hand, so I walked forward with hands open and heart pumping like crazy. "What seems to be the problem, Mitch?" I asked as coolly as I could. "You know darn well what the problem is," he said. "You pilfers Karen's house." Go it to Karen to create such a crazy story that Mitch felt driven to come perform cowboy in our driveway. I'm here to make sure you do the right thing and go before this gets ugly than it should be. Rather than becoming defensive, though, we decided to approach Mitch differently. "Mitch, why don't you come inside?" To my surprise, he hesitated, then nodded when we discussed this over a beer. "Fine, but I'm not leaving the gun," he said. "That's okay," I said. "We'll keep ours handy, too. Everyone owns a gun here. Showing you can hold your own is more important than intimidating someone." Mitch appeared to respect that, hence we all in, and opened a few beers. As the suspense relaxed somewhat, we began to tell our side of the story. For hours we spoke. We confirmed the deed with the bank and courthouse, told him how we had bought the house from Joe, and poured months of labor into renovating the place. Mitch listened, nodding sometimes, his look changing from mistrust to awareness. He sighed long ago and then muttered, "All right," laying his empty beer can on the table. I became enmeshed in Karen's narrative, but today I see that this isn't what she presented. I apologize for showing up like this, not likely to recur. Relief came over us, not before adding one more bit. You know, this neighborhood's been a lot quieter since Brad left. Mitch left that day without incident. There are no inebriated young people walking aimlessly in the streets anymore. That seemed like the end of it. For what it's worth, I'm delighted you are here. Of course, Karen was not done. The stories she had been disseminating continued to trickle through the area. Most of it was benign. Charges that we conned an old man or schemed our way into the property seemed reasonable. But some of it got quite absurd. Initially, we disregarded her attempts to persuade others that we were surreptitiously keeping drugs in the basement. A basement we had recently rebuilt, from physical rubble, mind you. Those who knew us assumed the rest would blow away. Those who knew her would not accept her lies, but soon her lies began to influence the one thing Karen valued most, her convenience shop. You see, Karen's small store was the only game in town. The expensive charges or the poor customer service, which was non-existent, made it unpopular. It was only the closest location to pick basics without having to travel a great distance into town. And for years, Karen had a wonderful thing going. The neighbors let her eccentricities as they depended on her store, but everything changed when her son Brad returned into the scene. Karen let him live in the apartment above the store and assign him responsibility for running it fresh out of jail. Brad was supposed to start anew, but he couldn't kick his old ways. Starting with double charging things and pocketing the difference, he began stealing money from consumers. People soon noticed, and word spread quickly. We were among the first to catch on. One day I purchased a loaf of bread and discovered my receipt did not match what I had paid. Considering that could be an honest error, I mentioned it to Karen. Now I'm all for allowing folks the benefit of the doubt, but instead of treating it seriously, she dismissed me with some justification like the register acting up. But when it happened once more, and repeatedly, I sensed something dubious was underway. Though most of them were still skeptical of us due to Karen's past rumors, I told a few neighbors about it, hoping to warn them. Then came the day Mitch turned up once more, this time considerably friendlier. They either didn't believe us or didn't want to become involved. He stopped by sometimes for a beverage or a conversation by now because he had discovered Karen's stories about us were false. We told him about the problems at Karen's store on one of these visits. "You sure about that?" "Positive," I said, frowning at his question. "We have receipts to prove it," Mitch said initially unconvincingly. He stated he would clear the misunderstanding by talking to Karen and Brad. And he did. But for all his neighborhood knowledge, Mitch let it slip while Karen spun the same tale about the register malfunction. He advised us not to start false rumors about them any longer, and that was it. We felt it wouldn't be worth the trouble shopping there anymore. But other neighbors began monitoring their receipts more closely over time. The reality about Brad's machinations started to slowly but definitely show itself. Then the day arrived when Mitch, good old Mitch, made the connections. Reaching into Karen's business with receipts in hand, he launched a vocal diatribe loud enough for us to hear next door. He did not stop there either. In one day, Mitch went door to door showing the receipts to every neighbor, outlining exactly how Karen and Brad had been offering everyone off target. The store lost its devoted clientele practically overnight. For a few years, Karen stayed on, depending on summer visitors and guests. But the lack of consistent business really suffered when winter arrived. The store was losing money right out of the second winter. Karen had to close it permanently by the third. This signaled the start of her actual collapse. As it happened, though, that was only the preamble for what was to come. By the time Karen's convenience shop closed, the neighborhood began to show promise for us. People who had avoided us due to her lies began to warm us after Mitch's demolition of her company, generating some goodwill. At last, we started to feel like a part of the community. Karen, as you may have predicted, was not going to let that slide. Oh no, she still had a lot of pettiness left in her. Her next action was quite embarrassing. It all started when we decided to erect a privacy fence. After all that had gone down, we needed some privacy where we wouldn't have to feel Karen's eyes fixed on us non-stop. I swear the woman seemed to show up outside any time we so much walked into our yard. She was clearly watching us, whether she was walking her dog, pulling weeds, or just standing there looking active. We therefore decided that a fence would be the ideal solution. Still, we were not seeking to be jerks about it. We went to Karen to let her know what we were going to do, colors, materials, placement, so she wouldn't have to spend every day staring at something she loathed. We also offered to allow her to participate in the design process. Seems reasonable, right? Not to Karen. She vehemently objected the moment we brought it up. She said she would not let a fence be erected since it would ruin the look of the neighborhood. We gently told her we didn't really need her approval since it would be on our property. Things got hot at that point. Karen began yelling about how the disputed property wasn't even originally ours. She claimed the fence would intrude on her territory and she would battle valiantly to stop us from erecting it. Initially, we assumed she was lying. We chose to personally verify the property lines, though, in order to prevent any future conflicts. We descended to the courtroom to pick up copies of our deed and the property map. It was then that we learned, shockingly, Karen had been living on a piece of our land for years. We brought this up with Karen, assuming we could handle it amicably. She had a little shed and part of her garden right in the middle of a triangle-shaped portion legally belonging to us. We even promised to trade it for a less difficult area of her land that connected with ours, or sell her the section she was using. Karen, though, had no interest in concessions. "That's my property," she called out. "I have no interest in what your little papers say." Any possibility of a peaceful resolution vanished at that point. "You are just liars and robbers trying to claim what is mine." Karen sank in her heels, and the property argument started. Let me now clarify something about our neighborhood. Property lines around here are sometimes somewhat unusual. This is a rural place, and many of the actions here date decades or even centuries. Vary of exact measures, they rely on nebulous landmarks like large oak tree to the big rock by the stream. Some of those landmarks are long gone, which fuels very frequent conflicts. This is why our state has rigorous rules controlling surveys and surveyors. Here's how it works. Should a surveyor produce a poor survey, even by mistake, they risk harsh penalties. Fines, licenses lost, lawsuits filed by everyone the error affects, the works. And should a surveyor be found misrepresenting results or accepting a bribe? Knowing all this, we set out to locate a surveyor who could verify the property lines and resolve the situation once and for all. Bribing them faces equally severe penalties. Every time we did, though, we would line someone up, and Karen would swoop in, introduce herself, and subtly suggest the ongoing conflict. Not unexpectedly, most of the surveyors we spoke with were scared off. Then we discovered something else. The original markers from the bank's survey, those put when we acquired the house, had vanished without explanation. Gee, we were stranded without markings and without a surveyor, ready to risk being involved. Who could have done that? Every price we obtained was shockingly high, as local surveyors understood the danger involved in accepting a case like ours. At this point, hiring someone would cost us as much, or more, than the contested area was worth, and things would get much worse. A few months ago, a terrible storm tore across the region, bringing strong winds and rain. One of the huge old trees on the contested land collapsed right next to the road. It utterly totaled a brand new sports car traveling by at the time, wiped out a portion of our neighbor's yard, and seriously damaged a utility pole. Although no one was injured, the aftermath was a shambles. We hardly had time to sort through the damage when we got a bill in the mail covering the damages to the car and property, over $200,000. My jaw ground down on the floor. That sum exceeded what we had paid for the house. Karen's lies were the main cause. The insurance company said the tree belonged on our land and we were liable for the damage. We contacted them right away and clarified the matter, noting the continuous conflict and offering supporting records. They first disagreed with us, stating the tree was obviously on our land based on their maps. They grudgingly agreed to look further when we sent them the name of the surveyor Karen had engaged. 1 week later, we received another letter from the insurance company. It was directed to Karen this time. The survey came back, and shockingly, the tree was on her land. She was thus in charge of the whole $200,000 bill. Later on, we discovered that Karen had sought to contest the claim as we had. But the surveyor she had hired to meddle with the lines couldn't risk owning to have changed the outcomes. The insurance company sided against her, and Karen had to pay the money. Her pride must have suffered even more than her wallet. She has been especially quiet since then. Of course, we are still saving money to pay a surveyor to reclaim our land. Public outbursts and rumors are no more, just a lot of gazing from her window. By now, the focus is more on the philosophy than on the land. Karen tried to take it from us, and she is currently paying for it, literally. If the $200,000 bill didn't wake Karen, I'm not sure what would have. She went substantially quieter as the insurance company resolved the issue and left her carrying the bag. She did not give up, though, either. Karen still had enough vitality for passive-aggressive actions and, naturally, her characteristic nosiness. Though Karen adored cooking the pot, her facade was beginning to reveal cracks not long after the storm catastrophe. Her conduct became desperate. She seemed to be trying to re-establish some kind of control over us. Her normal clear view from the window became complete monitoring. She wasn't new favorite pastime, pacing her yard, muttering loudly about thieves and people who think they own the place. She was not subtle, and the few neighbors who still tolerated her started keeping their distance. If we so much walked outside to grab the mail, she was there, either strolling her dog up and down the property line or seated on her porch pretending to read a magazine and staring daggers our way. But Karen's first major action following the insurance catastrophe was a garden. She was not about to let us believe we had won. More precisely, a garden maintained even more onto our land, the contested area. She arranged rows of veggies, a bird bath, and even a cheesy, small pink flamingo. All of it was way over what she had been describing as her line, certainly, but we were not ready to start another argument over a few tomatoes. We decided to let her have her small garden. At least that kept her occupied. But then the fence incident occurred. By now, we had given up on a complete privacy fence, at least until we could afford to engage a surveyor and fairly resolve the property line conflict. Rather, we agreed to put in an invisible dog fence. If you're not familiar, it's a technique whereby you lay a wire in the ground and use a certain collar to keep your dog safely contained. Should the dog approach the border too closely, the collar sounds a warning beep. Should they disregard the alert, it causes a minor shock. It's not dangerous. It's just enough to deter them from straying off what was clearly our property, leaving plenty of space to prevent any possible run-ins with Karen. Boy, were we wrong. The day we completed installing the system, Karen decided to mow her grass. The wire was buried a good 5 feet from her intended property line, far enough that we figured we wouldn't have to deal with her stupidity. She had always been exact about her yard, but this time she seemed unusually near to our side. From the window, I watched a woman purposefully run her mower across the dog fence wire. Sure enough, the mower sputtered, then died. She could have as well looked up and winked at me. It was quite clear. For a time, Karen remained there, staring at the smoking machine as though she couldn't believe what had happened. We laughed as she rushed inside, leaving the broken mower exactly in the yard. Though she had brought it on herself, it was small scale. The best thing about it is she couldn't even accuse us for the wire, which had been so far onto our land. And believe me, she was eager to. She said nothing about it to us either. After that, Karen started to fall apart. I suppose even she knew that trying to pin this one on us would be a lost cause. Her loss of convenience store had affected her more than we had thought. Her way of life started to slide without consistent money. She had always been the neighborhood's queen bee, showing off her riches with a well-kept yard and ostentatious cars. Still, the fissures were emerging now. The first indication was that her yard began to seem untidy. The grass grew a little taller, the flower beds were less vibrant, and her once pristine driveway began collecting a layer of dirt. It wasn't anything major at first, but for Karen, it was like the world could see her slipping. Then came the for sale signs. Slowly, bits and pieces of her remaining property went on the market. First, it was the section where Brad's old house had been before it was auctioned off. Then, part of the land where her store used to stand. It was clear she was trying to hang on to her main house, but the financial strain was becoming impossible to hide. The rest of the neighborhood took notice. People who had once sung Karen's praises now avoided her entirely. Mitch, in particular, seemed to delight in her misfortune. Every time he stopped by for a beer, he'd share the latest gossip about Karen's attempts to claw her way back to respectability. "She's trying to rent out the apartment above the old store," he said one evening, shaking his head. "Word is nobody's biting. Can't say I blame 'em. Who'd want to deal with her?" We laughed it off, but deep down I couldn't help feeling a twinge of satisfaction. After everything Karen had put us through, it was hard not to see this as karma finally catching up to her. But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no. Her next move was the pettiest yet, and ultimately, her undoing. One day, as we were working on a new garden bed in the backyard, Karen marched over to the property line, waving a piece of paper like a lunatic. It was a survey, her survey, the one she'd used to claim the disputed land. She stood there, shouting about how we were trespassing and threatening to call the cops if we didn't stop, destroying her property. We ignored her at first, but she kept going, louder and louder, until finally, Mitch showed up. He must have heard the commotion from down the street, and he wasn't happy. Karen, he said, his voice low and firm. What are you doing? This is my land, she screeched, thrusting the paper at him. They're ruining it, and I won't stand for it. Mitch took the paper, gave it a quick glance, and then looked back at Karen. You really want to go down this road again? He asked. After everything that's happened? Karen sputtered, her face turning red. It's my land. I'll do whatever I damn well please. Mitch sighed, handed the paper back, and walked away without another word. It was the beginning of the end for Karen, and she didn't even realize it. Karen's rant that day was the turning point. By then, the whole neighborhood knew she was grasping at straws, but her spectacle with Mitch cemented it. Her repeated antics were starting to backfire, and people were getting fed up. Mitch, our unofficial neighborhood peacekeeper, wasn't the type to let things go unchecked for long. And Karen? She was pushing her luck. The day after her outburst, Mitch stopped by our place for a chat. He didn't bring it up directly, but it was clear he was done dealing with Karen's nonsense. You know, he said, cracking open a cold beer. People like her always find a way to dig their own graves. You don't need to push, just let them keep shoveling. I laughed and nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Karen had been making enemies left and right for years, and it seemed like her time was finally running out. What I didn't expect was how quickly things would start to unravel. First, there was the property line dispute. After Karen's dramatic presentation of her survey, we decided it was time to take a closer look. With Mitch's help, we dug into the county records, trying to piece together the truth about the land. What we found was both surprising and satisfying. Karen's survey, the one she'd used to claim part of our property, wasn't official. It had never been registered with the county. Instead, it was some backdoor deal she'd arranged with a shady surveyor years ago, likely before we even moved in. The original survey, the one from when we purchased the property, was still on file and clearly showed the disputed land as ours. Armed with this information, we decided to let Karen know. But instead of confronting her directly, we went through the proper channels. We filed a formal complaint with the county, providing all the necessary documentation to back up our claim. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting the record straight once and for all. When Karen received the notice, she lost it. She came storming over, waving the letter like it was a declaration of war. You think you can steal from me again? She yelled, standing just outside our property line. You've got another thing coming. We didn't engage. We simply told her to take it up with the county and shut the door. Mitch, watching from his porch across the street, gave us a thumbs up. But Karen didn't take it to the county. Instead, she doubled down on her crusade. Over the next few weeks, she ramped up her pettiness to an absurd degree. She'd blast music from her yard at all hours of the night, throw her trash near our property, and even install motion sensor lights aimed directly at our windows. The final straw came when she tried to interfere with our dogs. One afternoon, I noticed Karen lurking near the invisible dog fence, tossing something onto the ground. When I went to investigate, I found scraps of raw chicken, some of it laced with what looked like rat poison. That was it. We called the police. To Karen's shock and disbelief, the police took the situation seriously. They didn't arrest her, but they gave her a stern warning and confiscated the poisoned bait. That alone seemed to rattle her. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely scared, like she was starting to realize that her actions had real consequences. But it wasn't the police that ultimately brought Karen down. That honor belonged to her own son, Brad. Remember Brad? The irresponsible party animal who lost his house because he couldn't pay property taxes? Well, he'd been laying low since Karen let him move into the apartment above the now-closed convenience store, or so we thought. One evening, Mitch stopped by with some juicy gossip. Apparently, Brad had been running a side hustle out of the apartment, something that wasn't exactly legal. Word was spreading that the cops were onto him, and it wasn't long before the rumors turned into reality. A few days later, we woke up to flashing lights and the sound of sirens. Police cars were parked outside Karen's property, and officers were hauling Brad out in handcuffs. Karen stood on her porch, screaming at the officers and crying hysterically as they loaded her son into the back of a cruiser. After Brad's arrest, Karen's world seemed to crumble. The embarrassment alone was enough to send her into hiding for a while. She stopped glaring at us from her window, stopped pacing her yard, and even stopped her petty attempts to make our lives miserable. But the real blow came when word got out about why Brad was arrested. Turns out, he'd been operating a small-time drug operation right under Karen's nose. It wasn't enough to make headlines, but it was enough to ruin whatever was left of Karen's reputation in the neighborhood. People who had once defended her now openly avoided her. And Mitch? Mitch was having a field day. "I tried to warn her," Mitch said one evening, shaking his head. "You can't keep stirring the pot without eventually getting burned." Karen, for all her bravado, had finally run out of allies. Her store was gone, her son was in jail, and the neighborhood had turned its back on her. Even the property dispute was turning against her, with the county siding in our favor and ordering her to remove the shed and garden encroaching on our land. It was a bittersweet victory. On one hand, we felt vindicated. Karen's years of torment were finally catching up to her. But on the other hand, there was a part of us that almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Karen's world was crumbling faster than anyone could have predicted. After Brad's arrest and the fallout from her property dispute with the county, it seemed like everything she touched turned to dust. But in true Karen fashion, she wasn't about to go down quietly. Even as the walls of her life closed in, she kept scrambling, trying to hold on to the tattered remains of her power over the neighborhood. What followed was a masterclass in self-destruction. Let's start with the aftermath of Brad's arrest. His little side hustle had caused quite a stir, and the legal process moved faster than anyone expected. Within a month, Brad had been convicted of several charges and sentenced to a few years in prison. This time, there was no convenient apartment waiting for him when he got out. Karen's funds were drying up, and it became clear she wouldn't be able to keep supporting her golden boy like she used to. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Brad had been her pride and joy, the entitled child who could do no wrong. Now he was a cautionary tale. Even Mitch, who had initially tried to give Karen the benefit of the doubt, couldn't resist poking fun. Heard Karen's trying to sell her car to cover Brad's legal fees, Mitch said one evening. "Guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, huh?" Meanwhile, the property dispute was reaching its climax. After the county sided with us, Karen was ordered to remove her shed and garden from our land. This was non-negotiable, and the deadline to comply was fast approaching. At first, she ignored the notice, likely hoping we'd back down, but when she realized we weren't going to budge, she tried every excuse in the book to delay the inevitable. "It's going to cost too much." She wailed to anyone who would listen. "They're stealing my family's legacy. How can they do this to me?" We stayed quiet, letting the legal process play out. Eventually, Karen ran out of options. On the morning of the final deadline, a crew showed up to tear down the shed and clear the garden. Karen stood in her yard, tears streaming down her face, yelling at the workers as they methodically dismantled everything. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't satisfying to watch. But the real chaos came after the shed was removed. Without it, Karen had nowhere to store her yard equipment, which had previously been tucked away neatly. Instead, her tools, bags of fertilizer, and other random junk started piling up in plain view. Her once pristine yard now looked like a cluttered mess, and the neighbors, who were already fed up with her, started complaining. "She's turning the place into a junkyard," one neighbor grumbled to Mitch. "Can't we do something about it?" Mitch, never one to let a good opportunity slip by, decided to take matters into his own hands. He filed a complaint with the local zoning board, citing Karen's growing pile of debris as a violation of community standards. A few weeks later, Karen received yet another notice, this time ordering her to clean up her yard or face fines. It was almost too much for her to handle. By this point, Karen was a shadow of her former self. The woman who once strutted through the neighborhood like a queen now avoided eye contact and kept her head down. Her reputation was in tatters, her finances were in shambles, and her son was behind bars. But instead of taking a step back to reevaluate her life, she clung to her bitterness like a lifeline. She started spreading new rumors, claiming we had bribed the county to win the property dispute. Of course, no one believed her anymore. The neighbors had seen through her lies, and with Mitch backing us up, Karen's credibility was non-existent. "She's a joke now," one neighbor told us. "Nobody takes her seriously anymore." Then came the storm that broke Karen for good, literally. Late one evening, another strong storm rolled through the area. High winds and heavy rain battered the neighborhood, and in the middle of the night, we heard a loud crack followed by a crash. When the storm finally passed, we went outside to assess the damage and found that one of Karen's trees, a massive old oak, had fallen onto her own house. The damage was catastrophic. The tree had crushed part of the roof, caved in a wall, and shattered several windows. Karen stood in the yard, drenched and sobbing, as emergency crews arrived to assess the scene. At first, we assumed her homeowner's insurance would cover the damage, but in a twist of karmic irony, it turned out that Karen had let her insurance lapse. Between the legal bills for Brad, the fines from the county, and her other mounting expenses, she simply couldn't afford it anymore. The repair costs were staggering, well over $100,000. Karen tried everything to scrape together the money, including listing more of her property for sale. But with her reputation in ruins, buyers were hesitant to deal with her. Desperation took over, and Karen even tried to guilt us into helping. "You have to lend me the money." She shouted at us one afternoon, "You're the reason I'm in this mess in the first place." We didn't take the bait. Instead, we politely reminded her that the choices leading to her current situation were entirely her own. The aftermath of the storm marked the beginning of the end for Karen. With no way to pay for the repairs, her house was condemned. She eventually sold the remains of her property at a loss and moved out of the neighborhood altogether. The day she left was the quietest, most peaceful day we'd had in years. Mitch came over that evening with a six-pack of beer, and we toasted to the end of an era. To Karen, he said with a smirk, raising his bottle. "May she find peace and a better attitude wherever she ends up." We laughed, clinking bottles, and finally allowed ourselves to relax. The nightmare was over. Karen's downfall wasn't just about her bad behavior. It was a lesson in how entitlement and bitterness can lead to self-destruction. She had every opportunity to make amends, to live peacefully, and to rebuild after her setbacks. But instead, she chose to double down, burning every bridge until there was nothing left. Karen's departure was like a breath of fresh air for the neighborhood. It felt as if a heavy weight had been lifted, and for the first time in years, people started acting like neighbors again. The street that once seemed divided by her antics was slowly coming together. Mitch, of course, played a big role in this transformation. With Karen gone, he shifted from conflict mediator to community builder. One of the first things Mitch did was organize a small block party. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few grills, some music, and a lot of cold drinks. He invited everyone, including us, and the turnout was surprisingly good. People who had avoided us during Karen's reign were now stopping by to chat and share stories. "She really had us fooled for a while," one neighbor admitted, shaking his head. "I can't believe we bought into her lies. Water under the bridge," I replied, raising my cup. "What matters is that we're all moving forward. It wasn't just talk either. Over the weeks that followed, we noticed little changes that signaled a shift in the neighborhood. People started waving when they passed by, kids played together in yards, and the tension that Karen had fostered seemed to melt away. Our own relationship with the neighborhood flourished. For years, we'd felt like outsiders, constantly on the defensive against Karen's rumors and manipulations. But now, with her gone, we were finally able to relax and connect with the people around us. One neighbor, an older gentleman named Hank, stopped by one afternoon while I was working on our garden. He leaned on the fence, a friendly smile on his face. "You know," he said, "I always thought Karen was a bit off. But she had a way of getting into people's heads. I'm glad you stuck it out. Thanks, Hank," I replied. "It wasn't easy, but it feels worth it now. He nodded, then chuckled. "If you ever need help with that garden, just holler. I've got some tricks up my sleeve." It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. For the first time, we felt truly welcomed. Karen's old property, now under new ownership, was another sign of the neighborhood's rebirth. The new owners, a young couple with a toddler and a dog, wasted no time fixing up the place. They tore down what was left of Karen's house and built a charming new home in its place. The overgrown yard was transformed into a lush garden, and the property quickly became one of the nicest on the street. When we first met them, they were understandably wary. After all, they'd heard stories about the drama surrounding the property. But once we explained our side of things, they warmed up quickly. "We quote Reed just here for a fresh start," the husband said, shaking my hand. "Sounds like this place could use 1-2 dot." We couldn't agree more. With Karen gone and the property dispute resolved, we decided it was finally time to revisit the idea of a privacy fence. This time there was no drama, no yelling matches, and no mysterious surveyors trying to mess things up. We hired a reputable company, and within a week the fence was up, a beautiful, sturdy barrier that gave us the peace we'd been craving. The first night we sat out in our backyard, enjoying the privacy, it felt like a victory. No more prying eyes, no more shouting over the fence, no more drama. Just us, the quiet hum of the neighborhood, and the distant sound of crickets. But while Karen was gone, her legacy of chaos wasn't entirely forgotten. Every now and then, Mitch would bring up a story about her antics, and we'd all share a good laugh. "Remember the time she tried to mow over your dog fence?" Mitch said one evening, cracking open a beer. "I'll never forget the look on her face when that mower died." We all laughed, the memory as ridiculous as it was satisfying. The neighborhood's transformation wasn't just about Karen's absence, though. It was about everyone deciding to rebuild what she had torn apart. People started taking pride in their homes and yards, organizing community events, and looking out for one another. One weekend, we all pitched in to fix up the local park, which had fallen into disrepair. Kids painted murals on the playground equipment, while the adults planted flowers and repaired benches. By the end of the day, the park was unrecognizable, and the sense of accomplishment was palpable. Mitch, of course, was in his element. He stood in the middle of the park, hands on his hips, surveying the work with a satisfied grin. "Not bad for a bunch of amateurs," he said. "Karen would have hated this." We all laughed, knowing he was probably right. As the months passed, Karen became more of a memory than a reality. Her name was still mentioned from time to time, usually as the punchline to a joke, but the fear and frustration she once inspired were gone. For us, it was a chance to finally enjoy the home we had worked so hard for. The garden flourished. The repairs we'd made felt worth every penny, and the friendships we'd built with our neighbors grew stronger every day. Mitch stopped by less frequently, no longer needing to mediate disputes or settle rumors. Instead, his visits became purely social, a beer here, a chat there. He seemed happier, too, like a man who could finally take a breath. Karen's story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when entitlement and bitterness go unchecked. But for us, it was also a lesson in perseverance, community, and the power of standing your ground. We'd weathered the storm, literally and figuratively, and come out stronger on the other side. As Mitch liked to say, sometimes karma takes its sweet time, but when it hits hard. As time passed, Karen's saga became less a part of our daily lives and more of a neighborhood legend. Every so often her name would come up, usually when someone was telling a story about the bad old days, or when Mitch had a few too many beers and wanted to relive one of his favorite rants. But for the most part, the chapter of Karen was closed, and life moved on. The neighborhood, once divided by her toxicity, had become a place where people looked out for each other. The transformation wasn't instant, and it wasn't always easy, but it felt like we had all grown from the experience. And while we didn't like to admit it, we owed a tiny piece of that growth to Karen. Her antics had forced us to band together and rediscover what it meant to be neighbors. One day, about a year after Karen moved out, a letter arrived in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but the sender's name was unmistakable. Karen. My heart sank as I opened it, half expecting another round of drama. But what I found instead left me speechless. It was an apology. The letter wasn't long or particularly eloquent, but it was sincere. Karen admitted she had let her anger and pride get the best of her, and she acknowledged the damage she had caused, not just to us, but to the entire neighborhood. She said that losing everything had given her a lot of time to reflect, and while she didn't expect forgiveness, she wanted to take responsibility for her actions. "I don't deserve your kindness," she wrote, "but I hope this letter brings you some peace. I've learned the hard way that holding on to bitterness only destroys you in the end." I sat there for a long time, reading and rereading her words. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as too little, too late. But another part, the part that had always believed people could change, wanted to believe she was genuine. I showed the letter to my partner and Mitch, both of whom had very different reactions. My partner thought it was a step in the right direction, a sign that Karen was trying to turn her life around. Mitch, on the other hand, was skeptical. "People like Karen don't change overnight," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But maybe she's finally starting to see the light. Either way, it doesn't hurt you to let it go." He was right. Holding on to the anger we'd felt for so long wasn't doing us any good. Karen was gone, and she wasn't coming back. What mattered now was how we chose to move forward. As the seasons turned, life in the neighborhood settled into a comfortable rhythm. The new owners of Karen's old property became some of our closest friends. They hosted barbecues in their yard, and their little boy often played with the other kids on the block. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that once defined that house. Mitch, ever the storyteller, became the unofficial historian of the neighborhood. He'd regale newcomers with tales of the Karen Wars, complete with exaggerated reenactments and dramatic pauses. But as much as we all laughed at the stories, there was an underlying sense of gratitude for the peace we had found and the lessons we had learned. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on our back porch, sipping a cup of tea and watching the leaves fall. The privacy fence we'd worked so hard to put up stood tall and sturdy, a symbol of everything we'd endured and overcome. The house, once a fixer-upper riddled with holes and decay, now felt like the dream home we had envisioned all those years ago. I thought about Karen and her letter, about the journey we'd all taken to get to this point. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. The next morning, Mitch stopped by as he often did, a mischievous grin on his face. "Guess who's back in town?" he said, leaning on the porch railing. I raised an eyebrow. "Not Karen?" "Not quite," he replied. "Brad, fresh out of the slammer. Apparently he's staying with some relatives a couple towns over. We both laughed, shaking our heads. Some things never change. But as Mitch left and I turned back to the house, I realized that, for us, Karen and Brad were no longer a source of stress or frustration. They were just stories now, part of the tapestry of our lives, a reminder of where we'd been and how far we'd come. The neighborhood isn't perfect, and it probably never will be. But it's ours. And every time I see kids playing in the park, or neighbors chatting over the fence, or Mitch holding court with one of his tales, I'm reminded of how far we've come, not just as individuals, but as a community. Karen's story may have ended in chaos, but ours is still being written, and for that, I'm grateful.